Well, good afternoon, everyone, and happy Thursday afternoon. It is the third Thursday, and so it's time for Tech Tips Live. Thanks so much for taking some time to join us. Certainly hope you find today's Tech Tips Live informational and with good stuff that you can use. I think Charles has put together a nice little package of, as we're saying here today, our house cleaning tips. So why don't you go ahead and go on to the next one. We will go ahead and use the Q&A functionality or put in the chat if you have a question while we're going through things. Please send those to us. We are happy to answer those. Sometimes we have to do those offline, but for the most part, we can get to those during our session today. And we will, when this is done, I do a little bit of editing, clean up the front end and things like that. We will get this posted to our YouTube channel and to our page. As always, welcome feedback and suggestions for future Tech Tips Live topics we are starting to work on and think about what we're going to do in 2023. And I'll give you a slight little preview. We are probably going to change things up a little bit. So looking forward to that as well. Charles, you want to go to the next one? Most all of you, I think if you've been here before, you know who I am. I'm Phil Mason, Vice President of Business Development here. And I've got on with me today, Charles Min.
Hello, everyone.
Charles, how long has it been since you did a Tech Tips Live? It's been a few months, hasn't it?
It has been a few months. I know I did one earlier. I want to say earlier this summer.
Yeah.
Probably about, I'd say somewhere between 4 to 6 months at this point.
Yeah. We always try and spread the wealth around and have different people just so you can hear from some of our different data scientists and project managers and things like that. But we've also had just a very busy year. We've had a lot of people out in the field and on projects. So happy to have Charles with me here today. And it's really a pretty simple agenda. And like we said, we're looking at housekeeping tips. And it's just those things that keep your GainSeeker running smoothly, running well, in tip-top shape, and so that you're not seeing things, going to retrieve that chart and having to wait what seems like forever as it goes out and crunches the number and brings all the data back. What are some of those things that you can do to keep it in tip-top shape? And as Charles and I worked on this, we really kind of decided to break it down in monthly, quarterly, and annual tasks so that all of you can get a pretty good idea of what are some of those things, or even kind of create that checklist of what it is you need to do. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to turn it over to you, Charles, and take it away.
Many thanks, Phil. Many thanks. Yeah, as Phil mentioned here, there's some things that you guys can do yourselves with your as GainSeeker administrators to make sure that you're running as best as you can. Some of these tasks are really, really straightforward. Some of these take a little bit more involvement, and others still will require IT assistance if you don't have the ability to do it on your own. So now there are some tasks that probably should be done a little bit more regularly, but at a bare minimum, we have a handful of monthly things that should be run roughly monthly, things that we recommend running quarterly, and then things that should be done once a year. You'll notice that in each one of these categories, I have one item that's marked, kind of noted with that this is kind of IT's domain. Most of these are all on the database itself, things that you kind of need some assistance setting up. So I'll excuse me. I will go into a little bit more detail on those topics when we get to it. But we'll start here with the monthly topics. First, users. Some of you guys may have 100 user logins to GainSeeker. The question is are all of those users active in your company? If not, if they are, but do they still require GainSeeker access? Have you actually, by leaving users available, that does pose a bit of a security risk. Someone could log in as a different user. Now, if there's especially if there's no password set up, and if they have the right, depending on their level of access, that's something that someone malicious, whether intentional or not, could go in and potentially delete a whole bunch of data. I will note that role audits should be done separately, largely because that does take a little bit more time and effort to work on. But again, with the by cleaning up that security risks and also reducing the number of names to scroll through, that does make it a lot easier to find the name that you're looking for. One thing that you may not be aware of, however, now some people do take advantage of this, others don't, but you can always type the first letter of the name that you're looking for. And when you have hundreds of users and everyone is set up to use their own login, if you type the first letter of the name, now it also depends on whether your naming scheme is first name, last name, or last name, comma, first name. Whatever the first letter is, typing that letter will jump to the first entry of that list in the list. So it does reduce the amount of scrolling that way too. Some people take advantage of it, some people don't, but it's something that does help there.
Hey, Charles, could I just jump in here?
Sure.
So I'm guessing, or I've had an experience sometimes where we don't do user maintenance, and this is on other applications. This is not GainSeeker, but we don't do user maintenance because that software was a little sloppy in the way they wrote things, or they too closely tied that user to data records and things that are in there. And if you remove a user, then it becomes this whole problem of, oh, now we have records that are unattached to someone, or it says, oh, well, if you're going to remove Joe Smith, then where do all Joe Smith's records go, and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. We don't have that problem. Right.
No.
I mean, that's something I want people to be confident that this won't cause issues.
No. So once the data has been written to the database, it's stored. The login is just to provide access to GainSeeker and all of the GainSeeker functionality. It has removing a user has nothing to do with what that user has done. Historically, if you delete a user, that user's information still exists in the database. It's just a matter of how is it accessed. Now, I will say that if you were to rename a user login and reset that login's information, some of the information is tied to the specific internal user ID of that user. That still won't make a huge difference because all that is just historical data. Again, we're not deleting any data. We're just removing the access.
Yep. Good. Thank you.
Or in the case I just mentioned, changing the access.
Yep.
By repurposing that person's ID to someone else. I'm going to jump down to the traceability audit first, because again, much like your list of users, if you have changes in your traceability values, equipment that that is no longer in use, you've added new lines. Sure, you want to add new values to your traceability list for your operators to choose during data entry. But by the same token, it's also good practice that if a value is now deprecated, you should remove that. Case in point, if you have a list of operators and they choose their name from a dropdown, and you've had some turnover, remove their names from the list. We actually, I believe this was in 9.4 that we added this functionality. It might have been 9.3. But we've added the ability to import a list of values from a CSV file. And by importing those values, you can either append all the values in the file to that traceability list, or you can blow the entire list out and use only the values in the file as the list. So it's good practice to clean that up, make sure that all the values in your traceability lists are current. That way you're not saving data for things that don't exist. Really, it doesn't make sense if you're putting something on line 2 when the name line 2 no longer exists. Things like that happen. So it is good practice to make sure that you do that. A lot of times when you know that a new value is coming, you're adding a line, you're adding a machine, you're adding names, operators, because you have your turnover. Adding it is very simple, but really should take the time to also remove the old stuff that no longer applies. Set a time to do that, and monthly is a good time to do that. For IT folk, database backups and verification. The thing that I want to highlight is that we at Hertzler don't assume that backups are being done regularly. And what I mean by that is that we talk about backups, but we're not responsible for ensuring that their backups are being done. We're not responsible for, if something goes wrong, trying to restore your data. You guys own your data. IT should, in theory, should be assisting with backing up your application data. Talk to them if they're not. It is something that you guys will want to make sure that the backups are being done regularly, as well as testing to make sure that a backup can be restored. If things go wrong and there's a huge, there's some data corruption, you're going to need those backups to be able to restore from. Now, one thing that we talk about is how far back can you restore? At a bare minimum, we recommend a daily backup. I put here that monthly backups is probably the smallest recommended frequency. IT should be a lot more know how frequent your databases should be backed up, and will plan accordingly. But if things go wrong, having a more frequent backup will allow more current data to be restored. If you go too long between backups and go too long between verifying that your backups work, you may lose potentially a lot of data that you may need. And by that, we mean data that you need to pull for a recent report. So moving on to our quarterly tips. Again, we've got a couple of things that as GainSeeker administrators you can do. When we talk about a security audit, we're talking about roles. Are your roles set up in such a way that the users of those roles can do exactly what they need and no more? This is what we call the principle of least privilege. They're able to do everything they need to, not much and not more than that. This way, users don't have more power than they should and are unable to go and potentially screw up the system. Now, there are some people who have used the system, used GainSeeker for a long time. They've been given more rights. Of course, if they don't know that some of these features exist, they won't touch it. That's almost as good, but by not giving them the ability to do so is another step of security that, instead of just having faith that they won't use or abuse that ability. So take advantage of the custom roles. By default, there are 4 roles that are predefined. Take advantage of the custom roles to set them up in the ways that you need for your system. They're there. Use as many as you need. If you need to give a specific person the ability to say run the SQL utility, are there others in that same role who would need that, or is that specific to this one person? If it's specific to this one person, does it make sense to give them a new custom role, or does it make sense to provide that functionality to everyone using that role? That's a question. That's why I said earlier, doing this role and security audit is a little bit more involved. So take the time to figure that out. Take the time to understand, that by giving people that don't necessarily need the ability to do more with the system, they could potentially mess things up. Roughly quarterly, it's a good idea to do a knowledge audit. And this is a knowledge audit of your team. Do people know what features we have? As an example, do you guys know the difference between GainSeeker charts and SPC charts and reports? We still have people using charts and reports. GainSeeker charts does just about everything that charts and reports does, and then some. I will admit there's one feature of charts and reports that I've found is something that tends to hold a lot of people back, but that's such a small item that I feel everything else that GainSeeker charts brings to the table far outweighs the loss of that one specific feature of charts and reports. This way you can make sure everyone's on the same page. Everyone's running the same reports. Everyone knows how to pull those reports. And if they don't know how to do something, well, training is an opportunity. Our Tech Tips Live recordings, that's a good place to start. Phil alluded to some of the changes that are coming, that are forthcoming. And so we're excited to share those with you when the time comes. So, and there's always support as well for questions and that your team may have. Additionally, if there's been a lot of turnover, are the people that you've replaced that have come in up to speed with GainSeeker? Do they know how to, operators on the floor, do they know how to properly enter data? Do they know how to change from one inspection or planned inspection to another? Do they know what the differences are? Do they know where to go for help if something breaks? Do they know to, do they contact IT, or do they come straight to our support? And then this is a good opportunity to figure out, do you guys need training? What do you need training on? With that, you can always reach out to support for questions. If you guys need additional training, reach out to our sales team, reach out to your account managers, and they'll gladly put together the literature for that. For IT, quarterly database maintenance is a good idea. Rebuilding indexes and recalculating the statistics on the GainSeeker SPC database really does improve retrieval performance. I actually had a question about this recently as a support ticket. How often should we be running it? Part of it depends on how much data you're putting in, but part of it also depends on the reports that you're running. What fields in your database are you constantly looking up data in? how much data are you looking at? How far back are you looking at data? A lot of these questions are not things that are, without the details of the report, we can't really give you, direct help with. We can just give the general idea, the general advice here. But then you can always add additional indexes as necessary to improve that lookup performance. That's, again, really dependent on the reports that you run. Microsoft SQL Server does recalculate statistics automatically if it's turned on. Sometimes that's not enough. So running it at a scheduled time does help. Running it too often, there's always a balance here. Running it too often isn't necessarily detrimental, but sometimes you don't get the performance out of it that you would by waiting a little bit longer to do so. I find that quarterly is about the right time frame. You can sometimes, you can hold off and do it every trimester, or you can do it biannually, semi-annually, excuse me, every 6 months. That schedule is really up to you. But quarterly is a good starting point. I would not do this maintenance more often than monthly. And I would at least do it once a year as well. So there's a sliding scale there. So on to the annual stuff. Now, you'll see from my list here that this is a little bit more IT focused. We have automatic archiving. What's the benefit of removing records from the tables? It's a smaller table size, faster retrieval. I've still worked with customers who are when looking up, when opening charts, they're still using the default low to today date period, which for a lot of you may be set to January 1st, 2010. And if you've been using GainSeeker for that long, even though we are restricting to the most recent 1,000 records by default, that still takes some time to go through and find what those most recent 1,000 records are. By starting at newer versions of GainSeeker, we've defaulted to January 1st, 2020. That does help a little bit. But in addition to reducing the number of records that you're looking through by archiving them out, do you really need to keep that historical data? Is it there just because you need to keep it? Is there a company need to have it accessible? What's your digital data retention policy? So that's something to talk about. A thing to note is that we have a lot of customers using SQL Express as their database of choice. SQL Express does not allow the SQL Server agent to run, which means that this cannot be scheduled through SQL Server. There are workarounds to that. If you guys have questions on that and you are running SQL Express, please reach out to support. We will gladly fill you in on that. Going on to the note sync, that is something that you can do individually. If you're getting a lot of notes, you're putting in a lot of, normally the notes are accompanied with data records that have real-time failure alarms. Sometimes those notes may get out of sync. Running note sync can help if you have a lot of notes. Sometimes, we have customers who don't run it and have not run it in the 10 plus years that they've had GainSeeker. So it's not always necessary, but running it could potentially help with similar to archiving, similar to the re-indexing. It is something that can definitely help performance. Lastly, real quick about version upgrades. I know that this is a touchy subject for some. Version upgrades, you take advantage of the latest features and fixes. And if we notice you're not on a recent version of GainSeeker, by being on the recent ones, we're not going to continually ask you to upgrade. That being said, we release a major version roughly every 12 to 18 months. So just upgrading to the major version should be sufficient. Upgrading to any other version, unless there's some specific fix that you need, you really don't need to. But it's something that I'm sure you'll have to coordinate with IT. So hopefully, that's something you can do annually, or whenever the time suits you for upgrading.
All right, Charles, one question on the note sync.
Sure.
For everybody who's on the call and maybe hasn't done that before, and I'll admit ignorance to this, where do you do that? Is it part of the administrative console?
So anyone who has access to the GainSeeker utility note sync function will be able to run the note sync. I want to say that it might be reserved. I'm confirming right now. Okay. I know it's part of the utility, but what I'm not sure of is it something that is set aside?
Yeah.
Virtual access. Yeah. It is part of the note manager tool, actually. So anyone who has access to the note manager could potentially run note sync.
Yep. I just got that same message via the back channel too. So yes, it's in the note manager.
Yep.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'd add on the version thing. We talked about it internally here lately. We fully understand and realize that sometimes in manufacturing, the old adage, of course, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is in place. And we have some clients who are a couple versions back, and just, be aware that sometimes when you call us up and need some help, if you're a number of versions back, sometimes people maybe haven't worked with that much, or the problem you're having might have been solved by a newer version. And so just encouraging people to keep up with versions and stay at least within the last couple of versions on the software, because it makes it easier for us to support you as well in a prompt and timely way. Well, thank you, Charles. We've run through that. We'll have this recording. We'll post it out there for those of you who maybe want to go back and record some of those things in terms of the monthly, quarterly, and annually. It's a really nice breakdown of how to keep your GainSeeker running smoothly. So I'll make a pitch. Our last Tech Tips Live of the year is coming up in December on the 15th. So again, the third Thursday, the earliest it can happen. And we're going to repeat our roundtable that we did last year. And so myself, we'll have Byron on, probably some people from development, talk a little bit about our cloud product. We'll probably have a technical product manager, and then someone from the field like Charles or Chris or Ian or someone as well. And just kind of talk about the year, talk about some of the trends that we're seeing in the business, and where we see manufacturing going. So hope you can join us then in December. Love to have you come along as we kind of recap the year. And we will talk some more about what we're going to do in 2023 as we have some new plans in store, some things up our sleeve for Tech Tips Live then. Thank you so much for joining us. I guess we're about out of time. I'll throw it out there. I'll give us maybe a minute here. If someone would have a question real quick, we can entertain that. But if not, we will say goodbye. Have a great Thanksgiving holiday, no matter what you're doing. If you're traveling, have safe travels, and we will catch up with you in December.